Good morning, class 8. Welcome back to your biology classroom once again. Today I will start pollination. So look at your book. For fusion of gametes to occur and seed to be formed, pollen grains produced in the anther must be transferred to the stigma of the pistil. So normally all of you know pollen grains that is produced in the anther must be transferred to the stigma of the pistil. The process by which the pollen grains from the anther of flower are transferred to the stigma of the same or another flower is called pollination. So actually what is pollination? It is a biological process for the reproduction by which the pollen grains just transferred from the anther of the flower to the stigma of the same or another flower is called pollination. जहाँ पे पोलन ग्रेन ट्रांसफर हो रहा है एंथर से स्टिग्मा तक, वो सेम फ्लावर में हो सकता है और दूसरा फ्लावर में हो सकता है. This biological process that is occurred for reproduction, it is also known as pollination. Pollination occurs naturally as well as artificially. Natural pollination is of the two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. What is self-pollination? The process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. Just mind it, the word. When the pollination process just taking place within a single flower, मतलब same flower में हो रहा है, तब उसको हम लोग क्या बोलेंगे? सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन. और अनदर फ्लावर ऑफ द सेम प्लांट, एक ही फ्लावर में हो रहा है या एक पेड़ का सेम फ्लावर में हो रहा है, तब जाके उसको हम लोग बोलेंगे सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन. सेम way क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन, इट इज द प्रोसेस ऑफ ट्रांसफर ऑफ द पोलन ग्रेन्स फ्रॉम द एंथर ऑफ द फ्लावर टू द स्टिग्मा ऑफ फ्लावर ऑफ अनदर प्लांट ऑफ द सेम स्पीसीज. जब ये पोलन ग्रेन्स ट्रांसफर हो रहा है एंथर टू स्टिग्मा ऑफ द डिफरेंट फ्लावर ऑफ द सेम स्पीसीज, तब जाके इस प्रोसेस को हम लोग बोलेंगे क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. सो लुक एट द डिफरेंस एट फर्स्ट, सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन एंड क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. इट ऑकर्स विद इन अ फ्लावर और बिटवीन टू फ्लावर्स ऑफ द सेम प्लांट. सेम प्लांट के अंदर एक ही फूल में या दूसरा फूल के अंदर जो पॉलिनेशन होगा उसको हम लोग बोलेंगे सेल्फ pollination, whereas cross pollination is occurs between the two different plants के अंदर सेम स्पीसीज होना चाहिए मगर टू डिफरेंट प्लांट्स के अंदर जो फ्लावर में जो पॉलिनेशन होगा उसको हम लोग बोलेंगे क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन. सेल्फ पॉलिनेशन, देयर इज नो एक्सटर्नल एजेंट फॉर द पॉलिनेशन इज रिक्वायर्ड, whereas cross pollination agents such as a wind, water, insects, birds and animals are required. Next, pollen grains are produced in a small numbers, thus no wastage of pollen grains occurs. But in case of cross-pollination, pollen grains are usually produced in a large numbers, thus wastage of pollen grains occurs. And flowers are usually not attractive. In case of self-pollination, फ्लावर्स को अट्रैक्टिव होने की कोई जरूरत नहीं होता है. दैट्स वाई फ्लावर्स आर नॉट यूजुअली अट्रैक्टिव. बट इन केस ऑफ क्रॉस पॉलिनेशन, फ्लावर्स शुड बी अट्रैक्टिव विद द कलरफुल पेटल्स फॉर अट्रैक्ट द इंसेक्ट्स और एनी एजेंट्स. नेक्स्ट, wind, water, insects, birds and other animals help in the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of the one flower to the stigma of the another flower. They are therefore called agents of pollination. So with the help of wind, water, insect, birds and other animals, the cross-pollination takes place. That's why they are also known as the agent of cross-pollination. Depending on the external agents involved, cross-pollination is classified as, so depending upon the agents, cross-pollination are different types. First, pollination by insect. Pollination by insect is called entomophily. Another name जो है ये बहुत अच्छे से याद रखना. Pollination by insect. This type of pollination is also known as entomophily because entomo means insect. That's why it is also known as entomophily. It is the most common method of natural pollination. Insects such as the bees, butterflies visit flowers to collect nectar. In the process, pollen grains get stuck to their body. When these insects visit another flower, pollen grains get transferred to the stigma of that flower. Flowers pollinated by insect are large, brightly colored, and often scented. So these are the main properties by the attraction of this particular plant. क्या flower should be insects जब ये पॉलिनेशन इंसेक्ट के द्वारा हो रहा है तो नॉर्मली फ्लावर्स के किस तरह का होता है? फ्लावर्स आर लार्ज, ब्राइटली कलर्ड एंड ऑफन सेंटेड. फॉर एग्जाम्पल salvia, rose, marigold, etc. Most flowers also produce nectar and are sweet smelling. For example, night jasmine, pollen grains, and the stigma of the most these flowers are sticky. So, in case of entomophily, जिस तरह का ये मतलब इंसेक्ट के द्वारा जो पॉलिनेशन हो रहा है दिस प्लांट का, so basically flowers produce the pollen grains and pollen grains are so much sticky. Next, pollination by wind. Pollination by wind is called anemophily. So pollination जब wind के द्वारा हो रहा है उस टाइप का pollination को हम लोग क्या बोलेंगे? Anemophily. Flowers of plants such as rice, maize, and grasses are pollinated by wind. So in case of that, example are very important. So basically, anemophily is found in case of such plants like rice, maize, and grasses. Most wind-pollinated flowers are small and have dry and light pollen grains, which can be easily carried by wind. So in case of that, basically pollen grains are small, dry, and lightweight, as which it is easily carried by wind. Pollen grains are produced in very large quantities so that at least some have a chance to reach the stigma. इस दौरान pollen grains बहुत ज़्यादा में प्रोडक्शन होता है क्योंकि वेस्टेज ज़्यादा होता है. There is a least chance to reach the stigma. The style projects out and has a large feathery stigma so that the pollen grains flying in the wind can be easily received. Table give the differences between the insect pollinated flowers and wind pollinated flowers. So look at the difference. Insect pollinated flowers, petals are large and brightly colored. But in case of anemophily, petals are small and white. They produce scent. Wind pollinated flowers, they do not produce scent. They produce nectar. They do not produce nectar. Anthers are attached to the short filaments. Filaments के द्वारा anther attached रहता है. जहाँ पे anthers are attached to the long filaments, this helps to expose them to the outside. Anthers जो है filament long filament के द्वारा attached रहता है. इस दौरान ये बाहर की तरफ झुक के रहता है. It's still to the outside. Pollen grains are produced in a small quantity, whereas the pollen grains are produced in a large quantity. क्योंकि wastage बहुत ज़्यादा होता है. There is least chance to reach the stigma. Stigma is sticky, flat or knob-like. But in case of anemophily, stigma is large and feathery. Next, pollination by wind or hydrophily. So pollination by water is called hydrophily. It occurs in aquatic plants such as hydrilla and vallisneria. Flowers pollinated by water are very light so that they can easily float on the surface. So flowers, basically which is produced for the hydrophily, they are so light as easily carried or float by water. They do not produce nectar. Pollen grains are produced in a large quantities. Male and female flowers are usually produced on the separate plants. This line को underline करना. Male and female flowers are usually produced on separate plants. In Vallisneria, the male flowers is submerged in water. On maturity, it gets detached and float on water. So what is the difference? देखो, in case of Vallisneria, male पार्ट जो होता है ये पानी के नीचे सबमर्ज रहता है बट आफ्टर गेटिंग मैच्योरिटी मेल फ्लावर इज सबमर्ज्ड इन वाटर सॉरी एंड आफ्टर गेटिंग मैच्योरिटी इट गेट डिटैच्ड एंड फ्लोट ऑन वाटर. मैच्योरिटी पाने के बाद मेल फ्लावर जो है ये डिटैच्ड होके पानी में फ्लोट करने लगता है. The female flower has a long stalk that too floats on the surface of water. When the male flower comes in contact with the female flowers, the pollen grains get deposited on the stigma and pollinated occurs. Next, pollination by animals. Birds, squirrels, and bats also act as agent of pollination when they suck nectar from flowers. In such cases, flowers are usually large and bright colored, growing on tall trees. For example, silk cotton trees. So student, hope all of you understood what I've discussed in this video because this portion is too easy. So for today, up to this portion.